Welcome to the University Credit Union Center. Please take a moment to locate the exit nearest to you. In the unlikely event of a fire alarm or other emergency, please leave through that exit. Out of courtesy to the graduates, please silence all cellular phones, and please note that there are designated photo areas located in the east and west press boxes. Thank you for coming and enjoy the ceremony.
You're so close.
You're so close.
You're so close. Can you feel it?
Can you feel it?
Do you believe it? That moment you have been waiting for.
Working for?
Once as undergraduates.
You strive to gain a broad education, perhaps savoring your newfound freedom and a taste of the college life.
But then, perhaps years later, you rededicated yourself
In pursuit of a specialized expertise.
A whole life built around a single question.
At UC Davis, graduate students have always been the bedrock of our success.
You perform so many critical and integral functions.
As scholars,
Researchers,
Teachers.
community builders.
You provide crucial assistance to both students and faculty and constitute an incredible community of diverse minds.
Completing a graduate degree
is a formidable achievement in advanced scholarship.
In spite of all the hurdles and hardships, you saw it through.
You no doubt received support along the way from family, friends,
advisors, and mentors. But ultimately, this accomplishment is yours alone.
This education, this degree, will likely open doors for you. It will create career opportunities.
But it also positions you to improve the lives of others.
To provide leadership and advocacy in a time when it is desperately needed.
But today, these future concerns can wait. Today, it's time to celebrate.
Go forth, grow forth, wherever life takes you.
Or wherever you take life.
May you find yourself always outgrowing expectations.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 2022 Commencement Convocation for Graduate Studies at the University of California, Davis is convened. Will Jennifer Sherrill please come forward to sing the national anthem? Please remain standing.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Please be seated. And now I would like to ask that you pause and reflect as we acknowledge the land. This ceremony is being held in the University Credit Union Center on the Davis campus, which sits on Patwin lands. The video we're about to see was recorded in the Native American Contemplative Garden.
We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Kachil Dihi Band of Wintoon Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzal Dihi Wintoon Nation, and Yochadehi Wintoon Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional homelands.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present to you Jean-Pierre Delplanque, Dean of Graduate Studies and Professor of Mechanical and Aeronautical Engineering. As you might guess, the teleprompters have gone out. Good luck, JP.
Thank you. It is a great honor to be here today to join you, our graduates, your family members, your mentors, and your loved ones, to celebrate the achievements that you've accomplished today. It is under the auspices of Graduate Council that this ceremony is held. I have members of the UC Davis leadership here with me on stage today, and the name of these individuals are shown above the stage. I'm going to ask the entire stage party to stand together to be recognized. Now I will ask the faculty present to please rise. I am pleased to present to you at this time the faculty members participating in the commencement this afternoon. We thank you for your many contributions to graduate education. Your devotion to teaching and mentoring enables our graduate students to succeed. Please be seated. Now I would like to introduce Provost and Vice Chancellor Mary Croghan. Mary Croghan has served as UC Davis Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor since July 2020. What a fateful date. Provost Croghan came to UC Davis with many years of distinguished service as both an administrator and a faculty member, chiefly at the University of California. After earning her Bachelor of Science degree in Community Health at UC Davis, and her PhD in epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins University School of Hygiene and Public Health, Provost Croghan spent 30 years as a professor at the UC San Francisco School of Medicine. In addition, Mary served as chair of the System-Wide Academic Senate in 2008-2009 and as executive director of the Research Grants Program Office at the UC Office of the President. Most recently, she served as Vice President for Research and Economic Development at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. As the Chief Academic Officer of UC Davis, including UC Davis Health in Sacramento, Provost Croghan oversees all aspects of the university's mission of teaching, research, and public service. Her top priorities include student success and equitable outcomes, maintaining and advancing educational excellence, augmenting the university's capacity to perform critical transdisciplinary research, and furthering its culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you, JP, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the graduate commencement for the class of 2022. So to the graduates, I want to make sure you appreciate how significant this achievement really is. You have shown the intellectual ability and scholarly fortitude to earn an advanced degree from a world-class university. A graduate degree requires so much in terms of the amount of work and level of sophistication expected of you, and therefore it is truly an exceptional level of dedication. In the opinion of many of us, and now I speak as a proud Aggie alumna myself, you have graduated from one of the world's best universities. Congratulations. So for each of our graduates, what you have learned during your time at UC Davis will empower you to meet a wide variety of formidable challenges in your career as well as in life. At the same time, your degree will forever tell the world that you are a person of persistence, determination, and intellectual capacity. As we all know, the ability to earn a master's or doctoral degree not only requires one to keep putting one foot in front of the other, but you must also develop the ability to stand on your own 2 feet, to feel the strength and power to defend your own scholarly accomplishments, and to be a true expert. This self-empowerment and your achievements will open doors for you. To the parents of our graduates, I want to let, yeah, you got it. I want to let you know that we understand this occasion marks your achievement too. Your student would not be here today without the strong support you have provided for many years and in many forms. And to other family members and friends, thank you for your support, ranging from wise advice and encouragement to participation in study groups to supplying urgently needed snacks and whatever other forms of support were necessary to help each other succeed. I have to add that this ceremony has a very personal importance for me too. I have admiration for and truly valued connections with numerous UC graduate students that are here today. So for those of you who think it's odd, there will be some people I'm hugging on this stage, because these students include not only 2 years of the leaders of the Graduate Students Association that I've had the pleasure to work with on virtually a daily basis, but also one of my own daughters and her friends. So there'll be some hugs. So I was about to ask you to join me in a round of applause to recognize the class of 22 as well as their family and friends, but you've already been graciously doing that. So now I'd like to speak directly to the graduates. It is an understatement to say that the last 2 years of studies were anything but typical. In those early pre-vaccine days, the pandemic was at the height of its destructive power, and the world's understanding of the COVID-19 virus was in its infancy. The atmosphere was one of fear and uncertainty, and there were tremendous disruptions in people's lives. Here I must recognize that your ability to persevere and excel in your academic work under these conditions makes your timely graduation all the more impressive. And I'm not going to say, yeah, that one deserves it. And I'm not going to say that the pandemic has a silver lining. That would just give the wrong impression. But I do believe that it has given all of us a very profound education on certain matters, one that is worth us holding on to. I want to focus on that for just a few minutes. As a result of this journey, I believe we now have a deeper understanding of the fragility of individual health and also what we've always called normal life. This is effectively a loud wake-up call to prepare for future large-scale health and societal calamities before they occur. We have seen a powerful demonstration of how interconnected people's lives are, both locally and globally, yet paradoxically, how divided our society and world are due to different beliefs, philosophies, and values. And on a more personal level, we've seen how many of us here and abroad lack the training or the disposition to think critically or address differences in points of view through respectful, rational, and fact-based dialogue. Indeed, the ongoing turmoil surrounding pandemic science and policy has revealed how many seek to impose their point of view through reckless defiance, misinformation, bullying, and threats. And to be sure, these are very sobering observations, but not really the sort one typically encounters on a celebratory occasion like graduation. But to exclude them entirely from today's program would do this ceremony, and truthfully, all of you, a disservice. Fortunately, our experience with the pandemic has also reinforced some reassuring truths. We have seen that we can endure great adversity and develop solutions to even the most formidable challenges. That is, if we remain optimistic and determined and work together. We have seen how greatly the welfare of our society and global society depends on recognizing our responsibility to aid others. And similarly, we have seen how essential to our own happiness is interaction with others, especially in-person interaction. In addition, we have inevitably been reminded of the things that are most important in our lives, those most worth protecting and those most worth nourishing, and these include our loved ones and those we cherish. And finally, I have one more lesson in my partial list, and it has to do with the student experience you all have in common. Universities such as ours have a uniquely valuable role to play in benefiting people, society, and our planet. We provide leadership to meet the greatest global challenges, whether it's pandemics like we've gone through, climate change, armed conflict, poverty, or other wicked problems. We educate those who will support and advance all members and noble aspects of our society, including our cherished democratic institutions and processes. We promote a sense of global responsibility and respect for different cultural traditions, and we help our students develop their ideas through critical thinking, empirical knowledge, and sound reasoning. So I was speaking of universities like UC Davis, but my words also point to many of the qualities that make you, our 2022 graduates and valued members of our Aggie family, exceptional individuals, because you possess these traits. So let me close by quickly mentioning what I want for each of you in the years ahead. I want you to find not just a place in the world, but your place in the world. There is nothing more important than feeling like you belong in your relationships, your surroundings, and your work. You have truly succeeded when you feel that all of these enrich your life and make you proud. And there is no doubt that as UC Davis graduates, you are well positioned for success as you continue your studies or pursue your career. As UC Davis graduates, you take seriously the responsibility we all share to promote the welfare of the world's people and our planet. And it is my hope that your sense of this responsibility will be a guiding force in your career and life. On a lighter note, I also hope that you keep in touch with UC Davis, visit the campus whenever possible, and also consider philanthropy to the university as a way to support programs you believe in or help others coming up after you. Like me, I hope you will have the pleasure of attending Picnic Day and other campus events with your friends and your own family for many years to come. And finally, got to get through this one. I hope you continue to feel pride and happiness in your achievement long after the ceremony is over, the kind of pride I feel to be an Aggie. I know that my own education here at UC Davis set me on an incredibly strong and solid path for a happy and productive life, for which I am forever grateful and proud. So to the class of 2022, Mairead, you're out there. That's my daughter. She can be known now. She's been very careful that nobody knew she was the Provost's daughter while she was a student. And she also didn't know I was going to out her in this speech. I'll pay for it. So to the class of 2022, I extend my heartiest congratulations and best wishes for the future. And if you don't mind, please join me and saying, "Go Eggs, go Eggs."
Thank you, Provost Chloe. It gives me great pleasure to introduce your 2022 Graduate Studies Commencement speaker, Dr. Laura Lindenfeld. Dr. Lindenfeld is the Dean of the School of Communication and Journalism and a Professor of Journalism at Stony Brook University, where she oversees a team of dedicated faculty and staff, including Pulitzer Prize winners, to educate and train the next generation of multimedia journalists and communication professionals. Dr. Lindenfeld also serves as the Executive Director of the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science, an organization that has trained more than 20,000 scientists from around the world. Founded by actor Alan Alda, the center provides international leadership in conducting and connecting research to practice to advance effective science communication. The organization's programming is based on the ALDA method, a form of communication training that blends improvisational theater exercises, could have used that today, and message design strategies. Dr. Lindenfeld holds a PhD in cultural studies from the University of California at Davis. As a communication researcher, her work focuses on how we can advance meaningful, productive interactions with communities, stakeholders, and decision makers by strengthening linkages between knowledge and action. Much of Laura's research has focused specifically on environmental and sustainability communication. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Lindenfeld.
Congratulations, graduates, families, and friends. I remember what it felt like to be in those chairs you are sitting in now. Like many of you may be feeling, I remember experiencing a sense of excitement and enthusiasm mixed with a healthy dose of anxiety about what was to come next in my career and life. Anybody feeling a little anxious? Just a little? But mostly happy, right? And I hadn't navigated my way through a pandemic as you have. Since being hooded by Jay Meckling, my wonderful doctor advisor, who's joining us here today. Jay, wave. Awesome. It's a lifetime commitment with your doctoral advisor. It's been a marvelous and powerful journey, one that I never imagined I'd go on, the seeds of which were sown right here at UC Davis. Let me say with conviction and clarity how incredibly honored, and I'm going to try not to cry. You had the waterworks going here. I get a little verklempt. How incredibly honored I am to stand before you today. I never in my wildest dreams imagined I'd be addressing you at your commencement ceremony about the road ahead of you. I'm so grateful to this institution that we all call home. Thank you, Chancellor May, Provost Krogan, Vice Provost and Dean Delplanque, all the other academic leaders, faculty, staff, families, and students who are here today. Can we give everyone a round of applause? It takes a big village. Thank you again to Jay Meckling and to my friend and Professor Anna Kuhn. Anna, can you wave? You're up there too. You brought me to Davis in the first place. You brought me here. I'm so grateful that my husband and son, Roger Schur and Mika Schur, are here today, along with other family members. Hey, Andy and Susanna, how is it up there? You having fun? Good cookies? Okay. Roger is also a UC Davis alum. He did his PhD here as well. I'm so proud to be sharing this moment with you. Each of you has been alongside me on this marathon we call life. Running with me, cheering me on, just like others have cheered you on. Like the friends and family members of today's graduating class, I guarantee you that I would not be here today without you next to me, all of you. But graduates, we're here because of you. Thank you to you and your families. Were it not for your accomplished, we wouldn't be here. You have so much to celebrate, and I really hope you do so thoroughly. You've taught and mentored others, helping to inspire those around you. You've advanced knowledge through your research, scholarly and creative activities. You've published, presented, performed, and displayed your work. You've also faced enormous pressures. You've witnessed and been affected by unprecedented challenges to our society and our world. And if you're anything like I was, you did much of it with sheer strength of will. Mixed in with those butterflies in your stomachs is probably a measurable dose of exhaustion, because each of you has come such a long way. And you have every right to be as proud of yourself as you have ever been. So coming here today made me, of course, you reflect. You come and you give a commencement speech at your alma mater, amazing, and you reflect on your own time. And it made me think about my time in grad school. I thought I'd share a little bit about what it was like for me and some experiences that shaped me in ways I'd never imagined. Now, I'm not someone who's really cut out to be a long-distance runner. I'm really not. But during my PhD program, I had the mad idea to run a marathon. Go figure. Why, you might ask, would someone who had never run more than 3 consecutive miles in her entire life up to that point take on a tremendous challenge? And do this in the middle of an already jam-packed doctoral program? Brilliant move or sheer insanity? I would like to think this was a moment of deep insights I'd yet to really process at that point. 6 days a week, I was out there. I know every inch of the Poudre Creek, putting in miles, learning just how much endurance I had. I pulled it off, but I wasn't alone. I had true friends like Lori Nichols-Sopkoff, my BFF and grad school sister, who's here today, who logged more miles with me in the Arboretum than I can count. What started as me muscling through and going it alone turned into a collaborative effort, and a life-changing one at that. Running became a powerful metaphor. It taught me that muscling through on your own is not a long-term strategy. It really took a team to accomplish that run and so much more. It wasn't just me out there, even when at times I was running alone. Running helped me finish my dissertation and move into a deeply rewarding career, deeply rewarding, all of which involved teamwork and collaboration. It's funny, I thought running a marathon, writing a dissertation, making tenure, leading change in higher education, and all those other things, I really thought it would be about grit. I was so wrong. You may have been told that strength, willpower, and something I can only describe as rough and readiness are what it takes to make it in this world. Can you relate? Gotta be tough and muscle through. Sheer willpower might work for a while, but it does not set us up for the grander challenges we face. And I believe we all here hold responsibilities for addressing those grand challenges. When you go it alone, you can certainly make some progress, but it's not enough to address the incredible, complex, interwoven, often troubling challenges we face as a society. Challenges we need your leadership to help address. Running on willpower alone can turn our focus heavily towards ourselves at the expense of understanding others' needs and desires. And we've got a really big societal set of ultra-marathons to face. We can only succeed if we face them together as a genuinely diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just society. We've got to go the distance together. I remember when it really hit me that we were in a pandemic. Do you remember that moment when you realized this isn't just something that's going to pass? We're in a pandemic. We had interim leadership on my campus, Stony Brook University, and we were all struggling, just like every other institution in the world. And my team and I looked at each other, and we offered to help support the university's messaging and communication efforts as communication professionals. We knew how important it was that messaging strike a balance between accuracy and compassion. And I really believe communication shapes our experience of the world. So this isn't just some little thing we put out a message. It's really about how we experience each other. So we found ourselves running communications for academic affairs at Stony Brook University, making sure everyone knew how to move classes online, what to do for students in need, how to come together virtually for some really tough conversations about political unrest, racial injustice, mental health, and so many other issues. We did this on top of our day jobs for 18 months because it's what needed to be done. Although we were tired, we were stronger and more resilient. Our ability to bring strength to the difficult tasks in life actually resides in our ability to trust and rely on others. We really cannot achieve anything of lasting value and impact without the support of others. The road to resilience demands empathy of ourselves and of others, and comfort with vulnerability. Leadership is a team sport. Resilience is about being in touch with how you feel and think. It's about being connected with each other and building bridges to how others feel and think, developing curiosity about how we are all different rather than passing judgment. We can't be resilient without empathy and a willingness to experience vulnerability. I was fortunate enough to make a move to Stony Brook University on Long Island, New York. I'm so proud to serve as Dean of the School of Communication and Journalism. I also have the tremendous fortune of directing the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science. Alan Alda, how many of you know who Alan Alda is? Famous actor from MASH. He's really wonderful. He's a phenomenal human being and actor, and he understood that we could make science more accessible and engaging to society by teaching scientists to communicate using improvisational theater. How cool is that? Alan founded the center in 2009, and I've had the joy of leading it together with a phenomenal team since 2016. We've worked with more than 20,000 scientists across the globe, science, technology, engineering, math, and health professionals whose work touches the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. So much of what we do is rooted in an effort to help people listen to each other. Starting with listening changes the focus so that communication becomes an active exchange rather than a message you send. Alan likes to say that communication only happens when you're willing to be changed by the message and the messenger. This is powerful and humbling work that inspires me every single day. And believe me, there have been some incredible bucket list experiences just like this one today. But you know what's funny? When I think about my happiest and most productive days, I actually think about the time I spend working together with people to get things done that need to get done. The work that we've mapped out for ourselves. It's those day-to-day activities that make possible the grander days like the one we're sharing right now. Mapping out things on whiteboards, refining a concept in a Google Doc that one of my colleagues initiated, analyzing data, going back to make sure we were thorough and conscientious. It's the experience of chopping wood, carrying water together, the acts that sound so mundane that wind up being the ones that in the end bring me the greatest joy and satisfaction. Strange as this may sound, it's the essence of working together day in, day out that enables us to make change. So here are a couple principles that guide me. Maybe they'll be helpful to you. First, whenever possible, build trust, not walls. We need each other despite the differences we might have, and we need to build trust with people who are different from ourselves, finding ways to create a larger, more diverse table for all of us to work at. Number two, Practice empathy and kindness, with kindness and humility. Listen and hear. Take in what others are experiencing and go out of your way to imagine how they feel. Building capacity for empathy enables us to connect, and connection is key to relationships. If we ground ourselves in a true sense of care for others, we can mobilize the energy it takes to overhaul the things that need to change so we can live in a fairer, more just, more equitable world. Number 3, to do all this, you have to embrace vulnerability. Brené Brown, who's done so much work on this topic, calls vulnerability, quote, the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path, end quote. Wait, I got one more. This one's really important. Celebrate accomplishments. Really celebrate them. Do you all have amazing plans after you leave? You better. And if not, you got to make some. Celebrate those accomplishments and successes with gratitude to those who helped you get where you are. For today, I hope you soak in the wonder of this amazing rite of passage. You've got a marathon or two ahead of you and behind you, and you have so many people on your team who are cheering for you, gathered with you here today, and I'm one of them. This is a monumental day. Hug your family and friends and celebrate big. You've earned it. You've made UC Davis proud. Now go out there and make a difference.
Thank you, Dr. Lindenfeld.
Certificates for completion of graduate curricula and the degrees conferred by the University of California attest to the scholastic achievement of the recipients. On behalf of the Academic Senate, I am pleased to recommend awarding of the degrees of Master of Arts, Master of Science, Master of Advanced Study, Master of Public Health, Master of Fine Arts, Doctor of Education, and Doctor of Philosophy to those who have completed the degree requirements.
Will only the candidates for the degrees Doctor of Education and Doctor of Philosophy please rise and remain standing while the degrees are conferred. The doctoral degrees are awarded to those who have successfully completed a rigorous course of study and have made original contributions to their particular fields of knowledge. The recipients of these degrees are prepared to assume positions of leadership in academia and in society. Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor Krogan, I present the candidates for the doctoral degrees.
Thank you. By virtue of the authority vested in me by the Regents of the University of California, I confer upon you the doctoral degree.
Will the candidates please be seated? Will the major professors of the recipients of the degree Doctor of Education and Doctor of Philosophy please bring their students forward as instructed by the ushers? Doctoral graduates are generally arranged on the floor alphabetically by the last name of their faculty presenter. This arrangement allows all of our graduates to be presented and walk the stage with their chosen faculty members.
Liberty Baker Galvin, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Kasim Al-Khatib. Layan Ma, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Court Anastasio. Nalin Singh, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Court Anastasio. Stephen Charles Herring, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Bradley Hanson. K.D. Martin, PhD in Agriculture and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Bradley Hanson. Anna Free, PhD in History, presented by Professor Ian Campbell. Nina Farnia, PhD in History, presented by Professor Charles Walker. Victor Nieto Cervantes, PhD in Spanish, presented by Professor Diana Amburu. Alba Maris Garcia, PhD in Spanish, presented by Professor Diana Aramburu. Carlos Abram Ruvalcaba, PhD in Mechanical and Aeronautical Engineering, presented by Professor Jean-Pierre Delpanique. Sheng Fang, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Prasant Mohapatra. Croy Lacanse, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Dean Tentillo. Ehsan Golami, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Ashwin Aravendikshan. Kristen Predick, PhD in German, presented by Professor Carlson Arnett and Professor Santiago Barrida Castanon. Louis Filipuzzi, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Farhad Asadian. Kevin Ryan Mallon, PhD in Mechanical and Aeronautical Engineering, presented by Professor Farhad Asadian. Julia Diet Kerr, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Matthew Augustine. Nkenchenyere Sharon Chidi Ugbulu, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Keith Barr. Amanda Jo Lindell, PhD in Education, presented by Professor Heidi Ballard. Fei Shui, PhD in Education, presented by Professor Heidi Ballard. Monica Chahal Buller, EDD in Educational Leadership, presented by Professor Heidi Ballard. Tonmar S. Johnson, EDD in Educational Leadership, presented by Professor Heidi Ballard. Christine Cinthala Punsalan Ambroso, EDD in Educational Leadership, presented by Professor Heidi Ballard. Allison Mary Sanders, EDD in Educational Leadership, presented by Professor Heidi Ballard. Nitin Kumar, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Michele Barbato. Sierra Diane Durham, PhD in Food Science, presented by Professor Daniela Barile. Yu Ping Huang, PhD in Food Science, presented by Professor Daniela Barile. Mark Reiterman, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Hee-Jung Bang. Jose Pablo Gomez Vasquez, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Hee-Jung Bang. Karen Marie Holcomb, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Christopher Barker. Olivia Chase Winoker, PhD in Etymology, presented by Professor Christopher Barker. Elizabeth Maureen Hammond, PhD in Immunology, presented by Professor Nicole Baumgarth. Fauna Lee Smith, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Nicole Baumgarth. Victoria Watson Zink, PhD in Population Biology, presented by Professor Rachel Bay. Calvin Lee, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Peter Beal. Erin Elizabeth Doherty, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Peter Bial. Alexander San Thuy Boon, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Peter Beal. Leonardo de Oliveira Silva, PhD in Spanish, presented by Professor Leopoldo Bernucci. Charlotte Elizabeth Webb Ambrosak, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Timothy Beatty. Danae Marie Horn, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Timothy Beatty. Insung Park, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Trish Berger. Juliana Mira Hernandez, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Donald Burrs. Eden Volkov, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Marian Bittler. Wenqing Li, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Heather Bishel. Hannah Rachel Safford, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Heather Bishel. Olivia Wright, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Heather Bishel. Thomas Mark Burmester, PhD in Performance Studies, presented by Professor Gina Bloom. Avril Ann Dye-Tearing, PhD in English, presented by Professor Gina Bloom. Sawyer K. Kemp, PhD in English, presented by Professor Gina Bloom. Lacey Gale Newton, PhD in Entomology, presented by Professor Jason Bond. Clay D. Swackhammer, PhD in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Gail Bornhorst. Kayla Horton Sparks, PhD in Pharmacology and Toxicology, presented by Professor Laura Borodinsky. Xinda Yin, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Richard Sexton. Chi Wu, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Richard Sexton. Haru Long, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Richard Sexton and Professor Kristen Kiesel. Ashley Catherine Spalding, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Kristen Kiesel. Patrick Basal, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Ross Baulanger. Tyler Joseph Othis, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Ross Baulanger. Hannah Elizabeth Dillman Murnane, PhD in Political Science, presented by Professor Amber Boydston. Narain Sinharib Rasho, PhD in Political Science, presented by Professor Amber Boydston. Yuhan Huang, PhD in Geography, presented by Professor Catherine Brinkley. Sam Rudvar, PhD in Geography, presented by Professor Catherine Brinkley. Xian Tang, PhD in Geography, presented by Professor Catherine Brinkley. Aaron Michael Coe, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Marie Burns. Benjamin Dawson, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor James Bushnell. Maya Marie Weeks, PhD in Geography, presented by Professor Claire Cannon. Keske William Teeple, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Nicholas Karamp. Veronica Padilla Vriesman, PhD in Earth and Planetary Sciences, presented by Professor Sandra Carlson. Alexander James Chesney, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Scott Carell. Thiago de Lucinia Coelho, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Scott Carell. Alice Lee, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor Scott Carell. Karen Ortiz Becerra, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Dahlia Ganem. Spencer Zosel Dahl, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Ricardo Castro. Benjamin Noah Kimmelman, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Daniel Sebra. Daisy Castillo Guzman, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Frederick Cheaton. Xi Pan, PhD in Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Physiology, presented by Professor Chao-Yin Chen. David Chen Yang, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Qingxian Chen. Jiyu Chen, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Hao Chen. Yanyuan Bai, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Shi Chen. Xiao Xiaoyang, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Shi Chen. Elizabeth Lee, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Simon Cherry. David Gerzen, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Shirley Chiang. Andrew Rakyong Kim, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Shirley Chiang. Yunia Beatriz Maria Componstela di Santinquiento, PhD in Transportation Technology and Policy, presented by Professor Giovanni Circella. Gonzalo Hernandez Hernandez, PhD in Biophysics, presented by Professor Colleen Clancy. Monica Beatriz Rodriguez Guevara, PhD in Economics, presented by Professor James Cloyne. Angela Claire Evans, PhD in Pharmacology and Toxicology, presented by Professor Matthew Coleman. Livingstone Muara Nganga, PhD in Plant Biology, presented by Professor Luca Comey. Sama M. Abdelrazek, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Richard Connon. Sarah Ann Stinson, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Richard Connon. Millie Ludmila Tikukina, PhD in Linguistics, presented by Professor David Corina. Kelly Suzanne Meyer, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Kyle Crabtree. Ariadna Elena Veganas Lee, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor James Crutchfield. Zipan Wang, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Nicholas Kuro. Kahui Lim, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Jeannie Darby. Marie Kyle McDonald, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Marisol de la Cadena. Merv Demir, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Sheila David. Cindy Koo, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Sheila David. Elizabeth Lotsoff, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Sheila David. Robert Perry Van Olstrand, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Sheila David. Carlos Jose Fieres Ducci, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Zi Ding. Amin Jalani, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Zi Ding. Han Wang, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Zi Ding. Tanjila Ahmed, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Zi Ding. Lucia Felix Palomares, PhD in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Erwin Donis Gonzalez. Masa Eftekari Hesari, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor David Doty. Yulong Liu, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Bruce Draper. Sydney Rose Wyatt, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professor Bruce Draper. Ari Grant Schwartz, PhD in Philosophy, presented by Professor Zoe Drayson. Fernando Amamburu Meros, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor George Dubkovsky. Priscilla Denise Glenn, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor George Dubkovsky. Candice Elaine Ralston, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Yelmer Erkins. Demiwaz Hallie Wolde-Jebriel, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Raina Engelstone. Bradley Scott Harris, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Roland Falleux. Yihang Huang, PhD in Materials Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Roland Falleux. Amjad Abdul Fattah Ramahi, PhD in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Fadi Fathala. Amy Jill Lombardi, PhD in Linguistics, presented by Professor Dana Ferris. Samantha Hartanto, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Andrew Fisher. Monica Daniela Zerker, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Lorena Garcia. Matthew Benjamin Curtis, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Stephen George. Zachary Alexander Rollins, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Stephen George. Peter Augustine Sariano, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Stephen George. Kimberly Jane Gibson, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Paul Getz. Victoria Ngandu Mutua, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Laurel Gershwin. Tia Cheng Yen, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Deepak Gosal. Maria Malvina Tsumori, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Paramita Ghosh. Diane Marquise Oliveira, PhD in Materials Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Jeffrey Gibling. Sayed Jean-Marco Saragard Monfared, PhD in Materials Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Jeffrey Gibling. Christine Marie Smoody, PhD in Materials Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Jeffrey Gibling. Mingwei Zhang, PhD in Materials Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Jeffrey Gibling. Marcela Vasquez Mayorga, PhD in Plant Pathology, presented by Professor Robert Gilbertson. Danielle Yvonne Cornejo Warner, PhD in Native American Studies, presented by Professor Elizabeth Grandia. Nadia Daniela Alexander Sanchez, PhD in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Elizabeth Grandia. Monica Dolores Parisi, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Stephen Greco. Jesse Reed Colber, PhD in Sociology, presented by Professor Maxine Craig. Xiaonan Jiang, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Kun Gu. Pre Chao Wu Ding Pong, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Robert Hackman. Bo Chang, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Timothy Hackman. Sarah Allison Grazadura, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Susan Handy. Pritham Ganupuru, PhD in Neuroscience, presented by Professor Timothy Hanks. Claire Marie Kova, PhD in Hydrologic Sciences, presented by Professor Thomas Harter. Marina Reyes Lopez Mautner, PhD in Hydrologic Sciences, presented by Professor Thomas Harter. Ning Chen, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Dennis Hartigan O'Connor. Madhuri Maya Cruz, PhD in Cultural Studies, presented by Professor Christopher Fallon.
Colin William Ryan Johnson, a PhD in Performance Studies, presented by Professor Christopher Fallon.
Leah Jiao, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor John Harvey. Julio Cesar Paniagua Fernandez, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor John Harvey. Abhishek Malala, PhD in Applied Mathematics, presented by Professor Alan Hastings. Andrea Cecilia Buller-Vassman, PhD in Human Development, presented by Professor Leah Hibble. Meital Mashash, PhD in Human Development, presented by Professor Paul Hastings. Lauren Christine Gonzalez, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Paul Hastings. Laura Catherine Christ, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Stephen Luck. Emmett Alexander Francis, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Volkmar Heinrich. Jessa Ray Growing Thunder, PhD in Native American Studies, presented by Professor Ines Hernandez Avila. Lucas Kyle Domulevitz, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Joshua Hyhath. Sarah Konopelski Snavely, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Hee-Chien Yi Ho. Jeffrey Michael Cook, PhD in Soils and Biogeochemistry, presented by Professor William Horwath. Parsoa Korsand, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Feridun Hormoz Diari. Jui Y. Hukuda, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Yu-Lo Shi. Ming-Si Guo, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Yu-Lo Xie. Jessica L. Huang, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Mark Husing. Sharon Lee, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Mark Husing. Alex M. Maula, PhD in Integrative Genetics and Genomics, presented by Professor Mark Husing. Glenn Michael Noguchi, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Mark Husing. Barbara Ann Gunn, PhD in Spanish, presented by Professor Robert Irwin. Rebecca Mata Barbosa, PhD in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Tian Chi Hong. Cesar Bartolo Perez, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor M. Saiful Islam. Xie Jiang, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Lian Zhao. Peter Keen Benoliel, PhD in Transportation Technology and Policy, presented by Professor Alan Jen. Jinping Gao, PhD in Transportation Technology and Policy and Master of Science in Statistics, presented by Professor Alan Jen. Gregory Joseph Miller, PhD in Energy Systems, presented by Professor Alan Jen. Vishnu Vijayakumar, PhD in Transportation Technology and Policy, presented by Professor Alan Jen. Claire Sugihara, PhD in Energy Systems, presented by Professor Scott Hardman. Sunghyong Huang, PhD in Biostatistics, presented by Professor Jiming Jiang. Wan Li, PhD in Statistics, presented by Professor Jiming Jiang. Hansu Gloria Kem, PhD in Microbiology, presented by Professor Michelle Ego. Victoria Brykowski, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Suad Joseph. Justin Sky Malachowski, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Suad Joseph. Muniza Rizvi, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Suad Joseph. Brett William Yezel, PhD in Neuroscience, presented by Professor Sanjay Joshi. Jack Cazette, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Selena Giuliano. Ahmad Sharif Kamal Hassan, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Umith Kanwinde. Zai Lao, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Umith Kanwinde. Ola Abdelhadi, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Teresa Keegan. Ani Mosesian, PhD in Public Health Sciences, presented by Professor Teresa Keegan. Arturo Oliver Wimera, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Michael Keel. Emily Dean Snyder, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Luvant Kuvas. Francisco Jesus Verido Lieva, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Robert Lusardi. Fanny Lee, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Nancy Keem. Jessica Dunn, PhD in Energy Systems, presented by Professor Alyssa Kendall. Mark Timus Lozano, PhD in Energy Systems, presented by Professor Alyssa Kendall. Carmen Banks, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Annie King. Linda Trong, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Annie King. Nicholas Hossein, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Andre Canosin. Michael Charles Myers, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Lloyd Knox. Brianna Dove Hamamoto, PhD in Pharmacology and Toxology, presented by Professor Heather Neisch. Mohammed Sadi Gurses, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Coleman Kronawitter. Mackenzie England, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Leah Kropitzer. Dipshika Shyamaraj Gilbile, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Tanya Kool. Jianhing Li, PhD in Materials Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Rupali Kukurisha. Laura Liliana Hernandez Basal, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Sashi Kunath. Austin Tran, PhD in Mathematics, presented by Professor Gregory Cooperberg. Minhui Huang, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Laifing Lei. Christopher Michael Bayer, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Kit Lam. Isabel Casanova, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Brian Leonard. Nikita Bacalzo, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Carlito Lebria. Garrett Anders Couture, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Carlito Lebria. Jonathan Minnick, PhD in Music, presented by Professor Beth Levy. Luke Anthony Salvato, PhD in Soils and Biogeochemistry, presented by Professor Bruce Lindquist. Yuqing Liu, PhD in Statistics, presented by Professor Xiaodong Li. Xingmei Liu, PhD in Statistics, presented by Professor Xidong Li. Minyuan Wang, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Gangyu Liu. Shasta Alexandra McMillan, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Bo Lonnerdahl. Kimberly Maria Trevino Toffer, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Angelique Louis. Junhan Cho, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Angelique Louis. Kaylin Michelle Taylor, PhD in Soils and Biogeochemistry, presented by Professor Mark Lundy. Caitlin Meredith Kieran, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Travis Liebert. Natalia Erika Cortez Pinso, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Gerardo McKenzie. Bushui Jiang, PhD in Mathematics, presented by Professor Garving Luli. Lindsay Jo Brodus, PhD in Animal Behavior, presented by Professor Maja Makagon-Stewart. Allison Pullen, PhD in Animal Behavior, presented by Professor Maja Makagon-Stewart. Irene Litvak-Zur, PhD in Political Science, presented by Professor Zeev Maus. Xiangnen Zhu, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Laura Markow. Alex Keith Beckerman, PhD in Medical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Donald Margolis. Jonathan Loyola, PhD in Mechanical and Aeronautical Engineering, presented by Professor Donald Margolis. Jordan McCrone, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Donald Margolis. Lindsay Marie Faig, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Nicholas Marsh Armstrong. Tiffany Hong, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Veronica Martinez Sardino. Erdem Eren, PhD in Materials Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Jeremy Mason. Ozan Borak Erichak, PhD in Materials Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Jeremy Mason. Jared Stimac, PhD in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Jeremy Mason. Marinka Swift, PhD in Linguistics, presented by Professor Julia Menard Warwick. Alejandro de la Fuente, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Stuart Myers. Azarine Alien Fotohui, PhD in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Stuart Myers. Tuani Ann Bull, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Richard Michael Moore. Ronghui Han, PhD in Plant Biology, presented by Professor Richard Michael Moore. Monica Pichanik Voss, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Michael Meineltowski. Melissa Ann Willis, PhD in English, presented by Professor Colin Milburn. Nathan Eugene Haig, PhD in Immunology, presented by Professor Lisa Miller. Catherine Rose Ewell, PhD in Food Science, presented by Professor Allison Mitchell. Hadi Bamiri, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Omid Momini. Gaurav Kaul, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Omid Momini. Hao Wang, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Omid Momini. Sophia Carolina Ayana Labrin, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Frank Mitlower. Elizabeth Grace Ross, PhD in Animal Biology, presented by Professor Frank Mitloner. Sarah Marion Prince, PhD in Political Science, presented by Professor Jeanette Moni. Bernie Bastian El Capi Planeta, PhD in Geography, presented by Professor Francis Moore. Janice Enida Patino Higuita, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Veronica Morales. Bharadwaj Nadankumar, PhD in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Karen Moxon. Jennifer Claire Bullen, PhD in Human Development, presented by Professor Peter Mundy. Xiang Kevin Lee, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Vinod Narayanan. Ramuel Safakulan, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Vinod Narayanan. Quang Hu Nguyen Hu, PhD in Food Science, presented by Professor Nitin Nitin. Nishari Wisutipat, PhD in Food Science, presented by Professor Nitin Nitin. Erin Christine Rumbaugh, PhD in Agriculture and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Anita Oberholster. Ye Chung, Ph.D. in Chemistry, presented by Professor Frank Osterloh. Gustavo Campos, Ph.D. in Chemical Engineering, presented by Professor Ahmet Palazzolo. Zhao Kun Ning, Ph.D. in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Zhongli Pan. Jiye Kang, Ph.D. in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Patricia Ortiza de Fraga. Zui Wang, Ph.D. in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Patricia Ortiza de Fraga. Yi Wang, Ph.D. in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Pramod Pandey. Muhammad Abdelgafar Awad, Ph.D. in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor John Owens. Carrie Allen Seitz, Jr., Ph.D. in Computer Science, presented by Professor John Owens. Ting-Yu Lee, Ph.D. in Hydrologic Sciences, presented by Professor Gregory Pasternak. Jason Scott Wiener, Ph.D. in Hydrologic Sciences, presented by Professor Gregory Pasternak. Justin Charles Wiltshire, Ph.D. in Economics, presented by Professor Giovanni Peri. Joshua Bennett Grelowitz, Ph.D. in Economics, presented by Professor Giovanni Peri. Alicia Kimberly Bird, Ph.D. in Ecology, presented by Professor Gail Patricelli. Mary K. Clapp, Ph.D. in Ecology, presented by Professor Gail Patricelli. Ryan Michelle Logston, Ph.D. in Animal Behavior, presented by Professor Gail Patricelli. Samuel Mike Wagner, Ph.D. in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor An Vu Pham. Priya Upadhyay, Ph.D. in Integrative Pathobiology, presented by Professor Kent Pinkerton. Oscar Hinojosa Espinosa, Ph.D. in Plant Biology, presented by Professor Daniel Potter. Rachel Ann Spaeth, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Daniel Potter. Mohammed Mahbubul Islam, PhD in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Bradley Pollock. Peter Joseph Torres, PhD in Linguistics, presented by Professor Vadehi Ramanthan Abbott. Cheng Xu, PhD in Applied Mathematics, presented by Professor Louis Radmacher. Donald Ray Williams, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Philippe Rast. Ardalan Raisi Sophie, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Bahram Ravani. Ra'ita Merahaban Temuri, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Bahram Ravani. Ali Reza Munesi Sohi, PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, presented by Professor Bahram Ravani. Maria Chernanok, PhD in Human Development, presented by Professor Susan Rivera. Emily Suzanne Foree, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Susan Rivera. Catherine Lawson, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Richard Robbins. Madeline Rowena Linhausen, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Richard Robbins. Liuan Hua, PhD in Ecology, presented by Professor Jorge Rodriguez. Jasmine Helen Wade, PhD in Cultural Studies, presented by Professor Mark Jung. John Man Chen, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Philip Rogaway. Tuan Wang, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Philip Rogaway. Hongxing Zhang, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Philip Rogaway. Lauren Suzanne Peterson, PhD in English, presented by Professor Elizabeth Miller. Rachel Ann DeWitt, PhD in English, presented by Professor Margaret Rhonda. Kristen Michelle George Bagdanoff, PhD in English, presented by Professor Margaret Rhonda. Sarah Rose Hahn, PhD in Performance Studies, presented by Professor Margaret Rhonda. Thomas Henry Hinsey, PhD in English, presented by Professor Matthew Stratton. Hongyan Hao, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Leslie Rose. Helen Lamb, PhD in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Leslie Rose. Nicholas Scott Talbot, PhD in Comparative Literature, presented by Professor Cheryl Ross. Anek Agong Dewi Megawati, PhD in Microbiology, presented by Professor Stephen Rothenberg. Christopher C.J. Yoshi Calabrese, PhD in Communication, presented by Professor Jeanette Ruiz. Thais Zimbres, PhD in Communication, presented by Professor Jeanette Ruiz. Suyash Gupta, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Mohammed Sandogi Hamediani. Ming Yang Zhou, PhD in Computer Science, presented by Professor Kenji Sage. Shiro Wu, PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor James Sanchirico. Christy Onsick, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Susanna Sawyer. Tunhang Feng, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Richard Skeletter. Yuxi Zhang, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Richard Skeletter. Brittany Mahogany Loofborough, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Rachel Scher. Genesis Lara, Ph.D. in History, presented by Professor Marion Schlotterbeck. Dorothy Ha Yuen Huang, Ph.D. in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Rebecca Schmidt. Anne Elizabeth Holmes, Ph.D. in Ecology, presented by Professor Andrea Schreier. Evelyn Phillips Sievert, Ph.D. in Immunology, presented by Professor Roger Simas. Erin Manigo, Ph.D. in Soils and Biogeochemistry, presented by Professor Kate Sko. Daniel Augustus Rath, Ph.D. in Soils and Biogeochemistry, presented by Professor Kate Sko. Benjamin David Bergstrom, Ph.D. in Chemistry, presented by Professor Jared Shaw. Dustin Joseph Hadley, Ph.D. in Biomedical Engineering, presented by Professor Eduardo Silva. Rashana Vicara Lidna, Ph.D. in French and Francophone Studies, presented by Professor Julia Simon. Caitlin Deanne French, Ph.D. in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Carolyn Slepsky. Rachel Lynn Lombardi, Ph.D. in Food Science, presented by Professor Carolyn Slepsky. Kirsten Joanna Claire Roseland, Ph.D. in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Carolyn Slepsky. Zichao Zhang, Ph.D. in Food Science, presented by Professor Carolyn Slepsky. Daniel Mazzone, Ph.D. in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Aaron Smith. Shen Chao Wang, Ph.D. in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Aaron Smith. Sharon Ichiko Brummett, Ph.D. in Epidemiology, presented by Professor Waltrina Smith. Yasmina N. Shueri, Ph.D. in Geography, presented by Professor Edward Spang. Josiah Tayag Catalan, Ph.D. in Music, presented by Professor Henry Spiller. Esther Luna de Lozier, Ph.D. in Music, presented by Professor Henry Spiller. Joachim Armand Veilla, Ph.D. in Agricultural and Resource Economics, presented by Professor Michael Springborn. Sarah Fulton Vanaska, Ph.D. in Psychology, presented by Professor Aubin Stamer. Gwen Marie Choder, Ph.D. in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Francine Steinberg. Jessica Elizabeth Mizzy Lumien, Ph.D. in Microbiology, presented by Professor Don Sumner. Kunye Zhao, Ph.D. in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Gang Sun. Ziahan Zhou, Ph.D. in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Gang Sun. Luis Eduardo Contreras Llano, Ph.D. in Biochemistry, Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, presented by Professor Qiming Tan. Binhan Hao, Ph.D. in Plant Biology, presented by Professor Stephen Thig. Erfan Nurbash, Ph.D. in Physics, presented by Professor J. Anthony Tyson. Norma Angelica Ordaz, Ph.D. in Plant Pathology, presented by Professor Diane Ullman. Stacy E. Siddle, Ph.D. in Neuroscience, presented by Professor Martin Usri. Moi Chu, Ph.D. in Materials Science and Engineering, presented by Professor Klaus van Bentham. Nora Alexandria Ramirez Silis, Ph.D. in Immunology, presented by Professor Judith Van de Water. Matthew Bruce, Ph.D. in Immunology, presented by Professor Judith Van de Water. Christopher Edward Alexander, Ph.D. in Applied Mathematics, presented by Professor J. Temple. Alexia Williams, Ph.D. in Psychology, presented by Professor Brian Traynor. Emily Clarissa Wright, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Brian Traynor. Un-Ha Shen, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Alan Van Deines. Jesse Sun, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Simin Bazir. Ashley Hobble, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Susan Kozlerich. Andrew Paul Justel, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Susan Kozlerich. Xiao Qi, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Susan Kozlerich. Fatima Adil Hussein, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Jesus Velasquez Mojica. Hannah Yu, PhD in Horticulture and Agronomy, presented by Professor Astrid Volder. John Randolph Dillon Dawson, PhD in Biophysics, presented by Professor Igor Vorobaivov. Catherine Ann Priesig Korn, PhD in Population Biology, presented by Professor Peter Rainwright. Andrew Sachs Ballin, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Andrew Waldron. Samuel Blitz, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor Andrew Waldron. Lucia Luna Victoria Indacochea, PhD in History, presented by Professor Charles Walker. Julio Aguilar Hidalgo, PhD in History, presented by Professor Charles Walker. Narissa Laura Wallace, EDD in Educational Leadership, presented by Professor Matthew Wallace. Lisa Marie O, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor Liping Wang. Chao Liao, PhD in Food Science, presented by Professor Luxin Wang. Hilary Sophia Green, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Selena Wang. James Ronald Campbell, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Andrew Waterhouse. Olumaiwa Titilabe Adegboyega, PhD in Anthropology, presented by Professor Timothy Weaver. Connor Thomas Gorman, PhD in Physics, presented by Professor David Webb. Maureen Page, PhD in Entomology, presented by Professor Neil Williams. Rigoberto Arenas, PhD in Chemistry, presented by Professor David Wilson. Kyle Richard Puger, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Brian Wiltgen. Jacob Henry Wilmot, PhD in Psychology, presented by Professor Brian Wiltgen. Joseph Marcos Martinez, PhD in Neuroscience, presented by Professor Yang Xiang. Xian Xiao, PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering, presented by Professor Sung Ju Yu. Madison Aaron Hathaway, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Thomas Young. Wenqing Jiang, PhD in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry, presented by Professor Ji Zhang. Ling Qiao, PhD in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Ruhong Jiang. Kei Wang, PhD in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Ruihong Zhang. Yuting Tang, PhD in Biological Systems Engineering, presented by Professor Tina Zikari. Maya El Kortabawi, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Aya Katarini Ziayatopoulou. Francesco Alejandro Humayer Guarchi, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor I. Katarini Ziayatopoulou. Rinmin Patel Duktrum, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Aya Katarini Ziayatopalu. Sumit Kumar Sinha, PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering, presented by Professor Aya Katarini Ziayatopalu. Brian Banek Hong, PhD in Nutritional Biology, presented by Professor Angela Zivkovic.
Masters now.
Yep.
Will only the candidates for the degree of Master of Fine Arts please rise and remain standing while the degrees are conferred. The recipients of the Master of Fine Arts degrees have successfully completed the equivalent of at least 3/4 of study and creative work in their respective disciplines. They are prepared for positions of responsibility in performance and teaching in their particular fields of study. Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor Krogan, I present the candidates for the degree Master of Fine Arts.
By virtue of the authority vested in me by the Regents of the University of California, I confer upon you the degree Master of Fine Arts.
There's more. Will the candidates please be seated? Will only the candidates for the degrees of Master of Science, Master of Arts, Master of Advanced Study, Master of Public Health, and Master of Engineering please rise and remain standing while the degrees are conferred? The recipients of the master's degrees have successfully completed their study, scholarship, and research in respective disciplines. They are prepared for positions of responsibility in their particular fields of study, as well as for more advanced graduate work. Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor Krogan, I present the candidates for the degrees of Master of Science, Master of Arts, Master of Advanced Studies, Master of Public Health, and Master of Engineering.
By virtue of the authority vested in me by the Regents of the University of California, I confer upon you the master's degree. Congratulations.
Will the candidates please be seated? Will the recipients of the master's degrees please come forward as directed by the ushers. Master's graduates are generally arranged alphabetically by the names of their graduate programs.
Professor Young-Suk Soo, presenting the recipients of the Master of Arts in Art and Dramatic Art. Helia Puyanfar. Professor Lucy Corin, presenting the recipients of the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. Gerardo Lamadrid Castillo. Adriana L. Mata Mendoza. Courtney Janie Pentar. Professor Guzde Gongku Burke, presenting the recipients of the Master of Fine Arts in Design. Fatima Tarek Mostafa. Valentina Hushkarech. Sima Pirmuradi. Edward James Whelan. Professor Sasha Nicklish, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Agricultural and Environmental Chemistry. Alice Nicole Henderson. Matthew Edward Mischel. Professor Katrina Gesso, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Agricultural and Resource Economics. Isabu Biniwal. Sofia Margarita Binzi. Pin Ling Chen. Pei Wen Cheng. Bailey Grace Cribbs. Yushu Du. Yan Gi. Christine June Howe. Sakumi Kawamoto. Evtik Mnatsakayan. Hana Muramatsu. Adriana Pham. Yifang Xu. Jia Xin Yin. Professor Anna Denicol, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Animal Biology. Montana Dawn Altman. Ali Teresa Carmichael. Patrick Raymond Kogo. Jason Chen Lin. Mackenzie C. Miner. Morgan Fox Orsolini. Professor Damian Kaelod, presenting the recipients of the Master of Arts in Anthropology. Angela Armstrong Ingram. Professor Michael Yonan, presenting the recipients of the Master of Arts in Art History. Samantha Adrian Cruz. Bella F. Payne. Anna Ray Schulman. Emily Leora Strimling Saz. Professor Erwan Monnier, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Atmospheric Science and Hydrologic Sciences. Tai Jun Wong. Amanda Marie Gately. Rachel Elspeth Haynes. Professor Shiliang Fan, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Biological Systems Engineering and Energy Systems. Laudia Anoche Bimpa. Crystal Dai Ding. Martin Eduardo Jeffers. Cayenne Lee. Clarice Rue. Wei Yi Sun. Scott William Adler. Yemi Timothy Akoda. Raymond A. Brissalt. Ashley Nicole Depew. Leslie Nelson. Daniel H. Simpson. Minakshi Viniktharaman. Professor Lucas Smith, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Biomedical Engineering. Vanessa Badzurto. Amar Singh Man. C.J. Maletti. Facundo Gabriel Ortega. Michelle Schimberg. Alexander Similaski. Ni Nuk Trin. Gabrielle Lauren Vandergag. Professor Thomas Ju, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Biophysics. Sambid Adhikari. Clayton Bruce Germolas. Professor Li Hong Chi, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Biostatistics. Ana Lencia Borio. Christina Marie Di Cesaris. Minji Kim. Aishna Prakash. Uni Ren. Apurv Srivastav. Professor Harishankar Manikantan, presenting the recipients of the Master of Engineering in Chemical Engineering. Brandon Austin Chen. Patrick Gabriel Negolescu. Brandon Steve Pizarro Carvajal. Vishnu Vig. Luoming Xu. Professor Dean Tentillo, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Chemistry and Pharmaceutical Chemistry. Nicole Michelle Tamayo. Xiujing Huang. Professor Cassandra Sweat, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Plant Pathology. Alyssa Leanne Brackrog. Professor Miguel Heyer Martello, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Civil and Environmental Engineering. Berkeley Nadine Anderson. Patrick Beckett. Prajwal Bhattarai. Lucy Bocanegra. Jenny Francis Callan. Justin Chiashang Chen. Nathan Clark. Michaela Miranda Ellis. Nicholas William Gomez. Abby Hill. Emily Marie Holt. Finn Hopp. Ali Kadem. Boris Katsyabuk. Igor L. Katsyabuk. Farzad Korosh Nijad. Nathan Curtis Love. Megan Lauren Marlowe. Angelica Araya Ortiz. Benjamin Patrick Snow. Anthony DiSera. Linnea Tucker. Denny Valagnia. Min Toi Vu. Catherine Eleonora Worcester. Ronghua Xiao. Professor Stephen Henry, presenting the recipients of the Master of Applied Science in Clinical Research. Brittany Mary Chatterton. Professor Jonathan London, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Community Development. Nellie Rose Graham. Yoka Ipe Ruth Potts. Jacqueline Marie Poasa Faliava. Alexandra Lee Rafanti. George Villa. Professor Timothy Parrish, presenting the recipients of the Master of Arts in Comparative Literature. Nia Anissa Shai. Professor Hamed Pirsiavash, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Computer Science. Vaibhav Archar Bhargav. Pratibha Agaral. Badal Akesh Bochak. Sunshine Yingshin Chong. Lei Chu. Jia Chi Liu. Rachit Dimicha. Prashant Reddy Dugirala. Charlie Ann Fornaka. Grisan Guru Murthy. David Haddad. Bharat Kinal. Avesh Menon. Jin Xiao Song. Lucas William Mohellenbrook. Aaron Abram Ong.
David Pham.
Jin Yong Pung. Christopher Joseph Peterson.
Siddhartha Punj.
Celine Tricia Cheney. Alicia Carly Sue. Abhas Tanwer. Yu Xuan Zhang. Kalyan Valeveti. Shi Yang. Sienna C.C. Marie Saltzen. Amy Nicole Woods. Xiaoxi Yu. Xiaoli Yang. Professor Barbara Ratzboucher, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Earth and Planetary Sciences. Baylin Nicole Grant. Kevin Douglas Butt. Jessica Contreras. Sarah Elizabeth Galdes. Viviana Garcia. Madeline Marie Hughes. Lisa Liao. Jonathan Jacob Mascarenas Carlson. Areli Pina Avalos. David Soltero. Professor Juan Sebastian Gomez Diaz, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Electrical and Computer Engineering. Usama Uthman Abu El Saud. Aaron William Bass. Akansha Bhatt. Tanuj Kalakuntala. Halchun Kaul. Sultij Kulkani. Victor Francesco Madrid. Trevor McCall Pollock. Kelly Nguyen. William Abel Orozco Cifuentas. Anirudh Ranchandran. Sermad Said. Shang Wang. Noah Ryan Tar. Wai Tiong Tioi. Professor Ian Grettenberger, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Entomology. Jasmine Ramirez Bonilla. Professor Mark Lubell, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Environmental Policy and Management. Daniela Victoria Arce. Antonia De Vedas. Amelia Claire Flack. Abigail Gummett. Andrea C. Grant. Brandon Paul Hrycak. Ava Claire Scully. Cheryl Hannah Winfield. Professor Danielle Harvey, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Epidemiology. Serene Liu. Brianna Ricketts. Professor Glenn Fox, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Food Science. Sophie Therese Held. Professor Allison Ehrlich, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Forensic Science. Holly Kathleen Allen. Hannah Marie David. Louis Angel Flores. Connor James Hogan. Ya-Jing Lee. Teresa Elena Lopez. Jason William Loxtercamp. Lisa Marie Montanez. Mary Margaret Mossberg. Nicole Marie Slattengren. Xingxi Wang. Aaron Taylor Winrow. Lucy Xiao Lu Shu. Professor Yong Choi, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Health Informatics. Kevin M. Cody. Salha Adel Al-Omairi.
Zixuan Shu.
Professor Elizabeth Mitchum, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Horticulture and Agronomy. Matthew Gregory Bustamante. Matthew Fatino. Nellie Guerra. Mohammad Rizal Islam. Grant Edward Johnson. Nico Linga. Sarah Lorraine Marsh. Paul Martinez. Stephen Leonid Spivak, Maria Zumkeller, Professor Ann Britt, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Integrative Genetics and Genomics. Haley Catherine Sheehy, Professor Amanda Crump, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in International Agricultural Development. James Gregory Durden, Nnoma Ononai, Lena Allison Pransky, Professor Emily Morgan, presenting the recipients of the Master of Arts in Linguistics. Professor Masood Jazbi, presenting the recipients of the Master of Arts in Linguistics. Skylar Jove Reese, Professor Yeyui Takamura, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Materials Science and Engineering. Sujoy Ghosh, Victor Jen Hee Leong, Professor Meredith Heinig, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Maternal and Child Nutrition. Carrie Lynn Christian,
Erica Costanzo,
Lulu Flores Esparza, Kit Giambastiani, Lisa Marie Natsavat, Harmeen Kaur, Rebecca Paris Silva, Candy Smith, Loretta K. Yo, Jessica Zamora, Professor Barbara Linka, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. Alexander Merrill Aldering, Austin Bo Cameron, Jennifer McGinnis Jen, Armando Gomez Hernandez, James David Jimenez Gordon, Julianne Emily Johnson, Raymond Pierre Odell, Ryan O'Vennell, Sol Pacheco Elorza, Diego Rojas, Christopher Ryan Romero, James Edward Thompson, Nicola Frank Michael Ventura, Wesley M. Watson, Mark William Lilia, Caitlin Elaine Patullo, Simone Nadine Sandoval, Lianging Li, Professor Carolyn Dewa, presenting the recipients of the Master of Public Health in Public Health. Alex Christine Acera. Rainey Chu. Katie L. Clyde. Mauricio Guerrero Villanueva. Joshua Tyler Hoffner. Sarah Hossein. George Hurtado Lopez. Radnik Kaur. King Davrick Lamotos. Yinhua Ma. Myreed Ciara Minihane. Shambhavi Mishra. Jocelyn Mobley. Jenny Moa. Juliana Marie Novice. Yasmin Pashmine Azar. Bhargavi Ram. Hannah Nicole Sarnoff. Elizabeth Savan. Dilpreet Singh. Maria Guadalupe Solorio Lopez. Arilet Ariel Sulihanyan. Caitlin Marie Stahl.
Emily Chan.
Professor Sat Darshan Khalsa, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Soils and Biogeochemistry. Suzette Nicole Santiago. Professor Claudia Sanchez Gutierrez, presenting the recipients of the Master of Arts in Spanish. Daniel Fonseca. Angelica Maria Gonzalez Bastidas. Lee Marlene Hauk. Hunter Kyle Snow. Maria Gisela Oriol Garate. Professor Mina Karzand, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Statistics. Nathan C. Castle. Yi Feng. Qinqi Li.
Zhong Xian Liu.
Yige Luo. Qin Wei. Xiaoyi Xu. Professor Jesus Parejas, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Transportation Technology and Policy. Sravya Kamalapuram. Sean McElroy. Maria Magdalena Silayan. Professor Dario Cantu, presenting the recipients of the Master of Science in Viticulture and Enology. Samuel Singh Demon. Nivrea Domenech Lopez.
Elizabeth Hutchison.
Brianna Ray Lopez. Jun Chi Ping. Tiffany Se Lee. Runzi Song. Saskia Marie Tingi. Yingshen Miao. Song Yan.
Let me again offer my sincere congratulations to all of our degree recipients. In keeping with the time-honored tradition, I now invite you to move your tassels from the right side of your cap to the left side of your cap. Congratulations.
Will the audience please remain in place during the recessional by the stage party, faculty, and degree recipients? Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. The 2022 Commencement Convocation for Graduate Studies at the University of California, Davis is now closed. Will everyone please rise?